Some losses cut so deep they change everything about how you see the world. For Clara, losing her husband meant watching her 6-year-old daughter grow up without the father she desperately needed. In the frontier town of Bitter Creek, this widow works as a seamstress while raising Lucy alone. Their simple life changes when Boone McGraw rides back into town. He's a giant man with a troubled past who's been hiding in the hills for years. Little Lucy sees something good in him that others can't. She asks him to marry her mother and give her a strong brother. Her innocent words touch something deep in Boone's heart, but his violent past is catching up with him. Clara must decide if she can trust this dangerous man with their future. Can someone who's done terrible things really change and become the family they need? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Clara's modest home on the edge of Bitter Creek, casting long shadows across her small sewing room. She sat hunched over her work table, carefully mending a tear in Mrs. Henderson's Sunday dress, her fingers moving with the practiced precision of someone who had learned to find solace in routine. The simple gold wedding band on her left hand caught the early sun as she worked, a constant reminder of the life she had built and lost. Clara Whitmore had been a widow for 2 years now, though some days it felt like yesterday, and others like a lifetime. At 28, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that spoke of inner strength rather than vanity, dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, green eyes that held both warmth and wariness, and hands that bore the evidence of honest work. Her late husband Thomas had often said she had the most capable hands in all of Colorado Territory, able to stitch a perfect seam or comfort a crying child with equal skill. The wooden doll that sat on the windowsill had been Thomas's last gift to their daughter Lucy. He had carved it during the long winter evenings, whittling away at a piece of pine while the snow piled high outside their door. The doll's simple features and carefully painted dress were a testament to a father's love, though Lucy rarely played with it now. It had become more of a shrine than a toy, a silent witness to what they had lost when the fever took Thomas in the spring of 1878. "Mama, I'm hungry," came a voice from the kitchen, followed by the sound of small feet padding across the wooden floor. Clara smiled, despite herself. Lucy had inherited her father's appetite and her mother's determination, a combination that kept Clara constantly on her toes. At 6 years old, Lucy Whitmore was a force of nature contained in a small package, blonde curls that refused to stay pinned, bright blue eyes that missed nothing, and a spirit that seemed too large for the constraints of their quiet life. "Come help me finish this seam, and then we'll make breakfast," Clara called back, setting down her needle. Lucy appeared in the doorway, still in her nightgown, her hair a golden tangle around her shoulders. "Why do you work so early, Mama?" Lucy climbed onto the chair beside her mother, peering at the delicate stitches with genuine interest. "Because Mrs. Henderson needs her dress for church tomorrow, and we need the money she'll pay us." Clara's voice was gentle but practical. She had learned to speak honestly with Lucy about their circumstances, though she tried to shield her from the full weight of their struggles. Lucy nodded solemnly, then picked up a spare piece of fabric and began mimicking her mother's movements. "Papa used to help with the heavy things, didn't he?" The question hung in the air between them, as such questions often did. Clara had grown skilled at navigating these moments, finding the balance between honoring Thomas's memory and helping Lucy move forward. "He did," Clara replied, reaching over to smooth a curl from Lucy's forehead. "And he would be very proud of how strong and helpful you've become." Their home was small but tidy, consisting of 3 rooms that Thomas had built with his own hands when they first arrived in Bitter Creek. The main room served as both kitchen and living space, with a stone fireplace that Clara had learned to tend herself. Her sewing area occupied one corner, where Thomas had built her a custom table with drawers for all her supplies. Lucy's small bedroom was barely large enough for a bed and chest, while Clara's room held little more than a bed and the wardrobe that had belonged to her mother. The town of Bitter Creek stretched along a single main street, flanked by businesses that served the surrounding farms and ranches. Miller's General Store anchored one end, while the Copperbell Saloon held court at the other. In between stood the bank, the barber shop, Doc Peterson's office, and a handful of other establishments that formed the backbone of their small community. The church, with its modest bell tower, sat on a slight rise overlooking the town, a symbol of hope and stability in an often uncertain world. Clara had come to know most of the townspeople well in the 2 years since Thomas's death. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, provided steady work with her extensive wardrobe and social obligations. Old Pete Miller sometimes let Clara take goods on credit when times were particularly tight, though she always made sure to settle her accounts promptly. Doc Peterson had been a godsend during Thomas's illness and continued to check on them regularly, never charging for these visits, though Clara suspected he wrote off more services than he admitted. The morning routine continued with breakfast, cornbread and milk, with a precious egg from their single hen, followed by Lucy's lessons at the kitchen table. Clara had been educated at a proper school back east before her family moved west, and she was determined that Lucy would not suffer for their reduced circumstances. Reading, writing, and arithmetic filled their mornings, while afternoons were reserved for practical skills like cooking, gardening, and sewing. "Tell me about when you and Papa first came here," Lucy requested as Clara helped her with her letters. It was a favorite story, one that Clara had told countless times but never tired of sharing. "We had been married just 6 months when we heard about the land available in Colorado Territory," Clara began, her voice taking on the cadence of a well-loved tale. "Papa had saved enough money working in the railroad yards back in Kansas, and we both dreamed of having our own place. When we first saw this valley, with the mountains rising up around it like protective walls, we knew we had found home." Lucy's pencil moved carefully across her slate as she practiced forming the letters of her name. "And then I was born, and we were a real family. The most real family that ever was," Clara confirmed, pressing a kiss to the top of Lucy's head. "And we still are, you and I. Families come in all different shapes and sizes, but love is what makes them real." The afternoon brought visitors, as it often did. Sarah Mitchell, the school teacher, stopped by with news from the territorial capital. Her husband ran the telegraph office, making her a valuable source of information about the wider world beyond Bitter Creek's borders. "There's been talk of bringing the railroad through the valley," Sarah reported as she and Clara sat on the small front porch, watching Lucy chase their chickens around the yard. "It could bring prosperity to the area, but it might change things too." Clara nodded thoughtfully. Change was a double-edged sword in a place like Bitter Creek. Growth could mean more opportunities for work and a better future for Lucy, but it also meant the loss of the close-knit community that had sustained them through their darkest days. "What do you think Thomas would have wanted?" Sarah asked gently. She had been one of Clara's closest friends since their arrival, and she understood the weight of decisions made alone. "He always said that standing still was the same as moving backward," Clara replied after a moment, "but he also believed in protecting what mattered most." As evening approached and Sarah took her leave, Clara and Lucy settled into their nighttime routine. Supper was simple but filling, followed by the evening chores and Lucy's bath in the tin tub by the fire. Clara treasured these quiet moments, when the demands of the day gave way to the gentle intimacy of mother and daughter. "Mama, do you ever get lonely?" Lucy asked, as Clara brushed out her damp curls. The question caught Clara off guard, though she should have expected it. Lucy had always been perceptive, sensing the currents of emotion that flowed beneath the surface of their daily life. "Sometimes," Clara admitted, choosing honesty over false reassurance. "But I have you, and that makes me feel less alone than I might otherwise. But don't you miss having a grown-up to talk to, someone big and strong like Papa was?" Clara's hand stilled on the brush. Where did this come from, little one? Lucy shrugged, the gesture almost too casual. Mary Beth Henderson says her mama thinks you should get married again. She says it's not natural for a woman to be alone so long. Clara sighed inwardly. She should have known that the town's gossips would eventually reach Lucy's ears. In a place as small as Bitter Creek, everyone's business became everyone else's concern, whether welcome or not. What Mrs. Henderson thinks isn't as important as what you and I think, Clara said carefully. Marriage isn't something you do just because other people expect it. It's something you do because you love someone and want to build a life together. Did you love Papa very much? More than all the stars in the sky. Lucy was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. Do you think you could love someone else that much again? Clara's heart clenched at the innocent hopefulness in her daughter's voice. I don't know, sweetheart. Love isn't something you can plan or predict. It just happens when it happens. But if it did happen, would you marry them, even if it meant things would be different? If I ever found someone who loved both of us and whom we both loved in return, then yes, I might consider it, Clara said softly. But that's a very big if, Lucy. Those kinds of feelings are rare and precious. Lucy nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied with this answer. As Clara tucked her into bed and kissed her goodnight, she couldn't shake the feeling that her daughter's questions had been leading somewhere specific. Lucy had inherited her father's strategic mind along with his stubborn streak, and Clara had learned to pay attention when she started asking pointed questions. The house settled into its nighttime quiet as Clara finished her evening chores. She sat for a while in Thomas's old chair by the fire, mending stockings and letting her mind wander. The simple gold band on her finger caught the firelight, and she found herself turning it absently, as she often did when her thoughts grew heavy. 2 years was a long time to carry grief, but it was also a short time to contemplate its end. Clara had built a life around her loss, structuring her days and decisions around the absence of her husband's presence. The thought of disrupting that careful balance both terrified and intrigued her in equal measure. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending clouds scudding across the face of the moon. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The frontier could be a lonely place, especially in the dark hours, when the vastness of the landscape made even the bravest soul feel small and vulnerable. As she prepared for bed, Clara found herself standing before the mirror in her bedroom, studying the face that looked back at her. 2 years of widowhood had left their mark, fine lines around her eyes, a certain wariness in her expression, a carefully controlled composure that had become second nature. She was still young, still capable of love and laughter, but those parts of herself felt buried beneath layers of responsibility and caution. Tomorrow would bring another day of sewing and teaching, of managing their modest household and navigating the complexities of small-town life. But tonight, inspired perhaps by Lucy's questions and the restless wind outside, Clara allowed herself to wonder what might lie beyond the careful boundaries of the life she had constructed. The thought was both frightening and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and contemplating the leap. The stranger rode into Bitter Creek on a Tuesday morning, when the autumn air carried the first hint of winter's approach. Clara noticed him from her window as she worked on Mrs. Peterson's winter coat, her needle pausing mid-stitch as the massive figure on horseback passed slowly down the main street. Even at a distance, there was something commanding about his presence, the way he sat his horse with easy confidence, the deliberate pace of his passage through town, the subtle alertness that suggested a man accustomed to watching his surroundings. Boone McGraw had changed in the 5 years since anyone in Bitter Creek had seen him, but his size remained unmistakable. At 6 feet 4 inches tall and broad through the shoulders, he dominated any space he occupied. His dark hair had grown longer, touched now with premature grey at the temples, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who had spent years under the open sky. But it was his eyes that marked the most significant change. Where once they had held the cold calculation of a professional gunfighter, they now carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom and carefully controlled regret. The wanted poster that had hung in Sheriff Bradley's office for 3 years bore little resemblance to the man who now dismounted outside Miller's general store. That poster showed a younger face, harder and more reckless, with the predatory confidence of someone who had never met a problem he couldn't solve with violence. The man who tied his horse to the hitching post moved with the same physical grace, but there was a wariness to his movements now, a careful consideration that spoke of lessons learned at considerable cost. Lucy Whitmore, however, saw none of this history or reputation when she rounded the corner of Henderson's Bank and nearly collided with the giant stranger. She had been chasing her wooden hoop down the boardwalk, her attention focused entirely on keeping it rolling in a straight line, when she stopped short and looked up at the towering figure before her. "Oh," she said simply, tilting her head back to meet his gaze. "You're very tall." Boone McGraw, who had faced down armed men without flinching, found himself momentarily speechless in the face of this small girl's direct observation. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, with golden curls escaping from carefully pinned braids and blue eyes that regarded him with open curiosity rather than the fear or suspicion he had grown accustomed to seeing in adult faces. "I suppose I am," he replied carefully, his voice rough from disuse. He had spent months in the mountains with only his horse for company, and conversation had become an unfamiliar exercise. "Are you a cowboy?" Lucy asked, studying his worn leather chaps and the weathered hat in his hands. "You look like the cowboys in my picture book, except bigger." "Something like that," Boone answered, glancing around to see if anyone was watching this unexpected encounter. The street was relatively quiet, but he knew that his presence in town would not go unnoticed for long. Lucy bent to retrieve her hoop, which had fallen when she stopped. "I'm Lucy Whitmore. My mama makes dresses and fixes things that are broken." "What's your name?" The simple question hit Boone with unexpected force. It had been so long since anyone had asked his name without threat or suspicion that he found himself hesitating, searching for an answer that felt honest without being dangerous. "Boone," he said finally, leaving off the surname that carried so much weight in these parts. "That's a funny name," Lucy observed with the brutal honesty of childhood. "But I like it. It sounds strong, like you look." She paused, studying his face with the same direct gaze. "Are you sad? You look like you might be sad." The observation was so unexpected and accurate that Boone felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of defenses he had maintained for years. "Maybe a little," he admitted, surprised by his own honesty. Lucy nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. "Mama gets sad sometimes too, especially when she looks at Papa's picture. But she says being sad is just love with nowhere to go, so it's not really a bad thing." Before Boone could formulate a response to this profound statement, Lucy's expression brightened with sudden inspiration. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to what she clearly believed was a whisper, but was actually loud enough for anyone nearby to hear clearly. "Do you want to marry my mama?" she asked, with the casual directness that only children could manage. "She's very pretty, and she's good at fixing things. And I think she gets lonely sometimes, even though she doesn't say so." Boone's eyes widened in shock, and he glanced around nervously to see if anyone had overheard this startling proposition. That's not little girl. You can't just—" But Lucy was warming to her theme, her blue eyes sparkling with excitement as the idea took full shape in her mind. "And if you married her, you could be my papa, and maybe you could give me a strong brother, like I've been wanting. Mama says families come in all different shapes, and I think our family could use someone big and strong like you." The words hung in the air between them, innocent and devastating in their simplicity. Boone felt something crack open inside him, a wall he had built to protect himself from exactly this kind of longing. The child's offer was impossible. Of course, he was the last man on earth who deserved such a gift, but the fact that she could see something in him worth wanting shook him to his core. "Lucy?" The voice came from behind him, sharp with concern and a mother's protective instincts. Boone turned to see a woman hurrying toward them, her green eyes fixed on her daughter with obvious worry. Clara Whitmore was smaller than he had expected, barely reaching his shoulder even in her practical boots. Her dark hair was pinned back in a style that emphasized the delicate bones of her face, and her calico dress spoke of modest circumstances but careful pride. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, intelligent and wary, with a depth that suggested she had seen more of life's hardships than her years should have allowed. "Lucy, what have I told you about talking to strangers?" Clara's voice was carefully controlled, but Boone could hear the underlying tension. "But Mama, this is Boone, and he's not really a stranger anymore because I introduced myself," Lucy replied with the logic that made perfect sense to a 6-year-old mind. "And I was just telling him about how you might want to get married again, and—" "Lucy." Clara's face flushed crimson as she reached for her daughter's hand. "I'm so sorry," she said to Boone, not quite meeting his eyes. "She's been asking a lot of questions lately about, well, she doesn't always understand that some thoughts should stay private." Boone found himself studying Clara's face, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the strength in the way she held herself despite her obvious embarrassment. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. "No harm done, ma'am," he said quietly, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "She's got a good heart, that's clear enough." Clara's eyes flicked up to meet his then, and Boone saw recognition dawn in their green depths. He watched her take in his size, his appearance, the way others on the street were beginning to notice and whisper among themselves. Her protective instincts sharpened visibly as she placed herself slightly between Lucy and this dangerous stranger. "Come along, Lucy," she said firmly, tugging on her daughter's hand. "We need to get home." But Lucy, with the stubborn streak she had inherited from both parents, planted her feet and looked up at Boone with desperate hope. "Will you think about it?" she asked earnestly. "About marrying Mama and giving me a brother? I know you'd be good at it because you have kind eyes, even when you try to look scary." The simple faith in her voice nearly undid him. Boone knelt down to bring himself closer to her level, acutely aware of Clara's tension as he did so. "Your Mama is very lucky to have someone who loves her as much as you do," he said carefully. "But grown-up things like marriage are complicated, little one. They can't be decided in one conversation on a street corner." Lucy nodded as if this made perfect sense. "But you'll think about it?" Boone glanced up at Clara, seeing the mortification and protective fury warring in her expression. She was clearly a woman who valued her privacy and independence, and her daughter's public matrimonial negotiations were probably her worst nightmare come to life. "I'll think about it," he promised Lucy, though his eyes remained on Clara's face as he spoke. As mother and daughter hurried away down the street, Boone remained kneeling on the wooden boards, watching them go. Lucy looked back twice, waving enthusiastically, while Clara kept her eyes fixed firmly ahead. But even from a distance, he could see the rigid set of her shoulders and the quick, agitated pace of her steps. Standing slowly, Boone became aware that their encounter had drawn considerable attention from the other people on the street. He could feel their stares, hear the whispered conversations beginning to spread the news of his return. By evening, everyone in Bitter Creek would know that Boone McGraw was back, and by morning, they would all have opinions about what that meant for their quiet town. But as he made his way toward the saloon, Boone found his thoughts returning not to the danger his presence might bring, but to a pair of green eyes filled with protective love and a small voice asking if he wanted to be part of a family. For a man who had spent 5 years in self-imposed exile, believing himself unworthy of redemption, Lucy Whitmore's innocent proposition had shattered something fundamental in his carefully constructed defenses. The question now was whether he had the courage to explore what might be possible, or the wisdom to ride away before his presence brought harm to the only 2 people in Bitter Creek who had looked at him and seen something worth saving. Clara's hands shook as she poured water into the wash basin that evening, her daughter's words echoing in her mind like a persistent bell. The embarrassment of Lucy's public matrimonial proposal had been excruciating enough, but it was the stranger's reaction that truly unsettled her. Instead of the awkward dismissal or uncomfortable laughter she might have expected, he had shown Lucy a gentleness that seemed at odds with his intimidating presence. "Lucy, we need to talk," Clara said as she helped her daughter prepare for bed. The broken fence post outside their kitchen window caught her eye, another reminder of the practical challenges she faced alone. Thomas had always handled the heavier repairs, and some tasks remained beyond her capability despite her determination to be self-sufficient. "About Boone?" Lucy asked hopefully, settling onto her bed with the wooden doll her father had carved. "I think he liked me, Mama. And did you see how big and strong he is? He could fix our fence and help with the heavy things." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, choosing her words carefully. "Sweetheart, you can't just ask strangers to marry me. It's not appropriate, and it puts them in an uncomfortable position." "But he didn't seem uncomfortable," Lucy protested. "He seemed sad, like maybe he needs a family as much as we need someone strong to help us." The astute observation gave Clara pause. There had indeed been something wounded in the tall stranger's eyes, a carefully contained pain that spoke of loss and regret. But she had also seen the way other townspeople had reacted to his presence, the whispered conversations and worried glances that suggested Boone McGraw's reputation preceded him. "What matters is that it's not safe to approach strangers, especially men like that," Clara said firmly. "Promise me you'll stay away from him." Lucy's lower lip jutted out in the stubborn expression Clara knew all too well. "But how can we know if he's good or bad if we don't talk to him? Maybe everyone is wrong about him. Maybe he just needs someone to give him a chance." Clara sighed, recognizing her own compassionate nature reflected in her daughter's words. It was both Lucy's greatest strength and her most dangerous vulnerability, this tendency to see the potential for good in everyone she met. Sometimes people have done things in their past that make them unsafe to be around, even if they seem nice. Clara explained gently, "I need you to trust my judgment on this, Lucy. Can you do that for me?" Lucy nodded reluctantly, but Clara could see the disappointment in her blue eyes. As she kissed her daughter goodnight and retreated to her own room, Clara found herself unable to shake the memory of her brief encounter with Boone McGraw. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind her house when she heard the sound of hammering from the direction of her broken fence. Peering around the corner of the house, she saw the tall stranger working with quiet efficiency to repair the damaged posts. For a moment, she simply watched him work. His movements were economical and skilled, speaking of a man accustomed to physical labor. He had removed his coat in deference to the warm morning sun, and Clara could see the play of muscles beneath his work shirt as he lifted the heavy posts into position. "Excuse me," she called, stepping into view with what she hoped was an authoritative bearing. "What are you doing on my property?" Boone straightened slowly, hammer in hand, and turned to face her. In the clear morning light, she could see the weathered lines around his eyes and the careful way he held himself, as if ready to move at a moment's notice. "Noticed you had some broken fencing," he said simply, his voice carrying the same gentle roughness she remembered from their encounter in town. "Thought I'd fix it." "I didn't ask you to fix it," Clara replied, though she could hear how churlish the words sounded even as she spoke them. "No, ma'am, you didn't." He set the hammer down carefully and reached for his coat. "I'll leave it as it was if you prefer." Something in his tone, respectful but not apologetic, understanding but not defensive, made Clara reconsider her automatic rejection of his help. The fence had been broken for months, and she had neither the tools nor the strength to repair it properly. Her pride warred with her practical nature as she watched him prepare to undo his work. "Wait," she said reluctantly. "Why would you want to help someone you don't even know?" Boone paused in the act of pulling on his coat, and Clara saw something shift in his expression. "Your daughter asked me yesterday if I wanted to marry you," he said quietly. "Seems to me that if a little girl thinks her mama needs help, then maybe she does." The directness of his answer caught Clara off guard. She had expected deflection or embarrassment, not this matter-of-fact acknowledgement of Lucy's matchmaking attempts. "Lucy doesn't understand the complexities of adult relationships," Clara said carefully. "She just knows that some tasks are difficult for me to manage alone. And she loves you enough to want to solve that problem," Boone observed, resuming his work on the fence. "That's not a small thing." Clara found herself studying his profile as he worked. There was something almost meditative about the way he approached the task, a careful attention to detail that spoke of a man who took pride in doing things properly. His hands, she noticed, were scarred but gentle, handling the tools with the same consideration he had shown when speaking to Lucy. "People in town seem to know you," she said after a while, her curiosity overcoming her caution, "but not favorably." Boone's hammer paused for just a moment before resuming its steady rhythm. "I've made mistakes," he said simply. "Some people don't forget easily." "What kind of mistakes?" This time he did stop working, turning to meet her gaze directly. "The kind that hurt people. The kind that make a man question whether he deserves a second chance." There was no self-pity in his voice, only a stark honesty that Clara found more unsettling than any excuse or denial might have been. She could see the weight of regret in his eyes, the careful control that suggested a man who had learned hard lessons about the consequences of his actions. "And do you deserve a second chance?" Boone was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know, but your daughter looked at me yesterday like maybe I might, and that's the first time in 5 years anyone has seen anything in me worth saving." The raw vulnerability in his admission made Clara's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. Whatever this man had done in his past, whatever reputation followed him, she could see that he carried the weight of it heavily. "Lucy has always been able to see the best in people," Clara said softly, "sometimes to her own detriment." "I wouldn't want to be the cause of any harm to her," Boone replied, returning to his work. "Or to you. If my presence here makes you uncomfortable, I'll finish this and move on." Clara watched him work for several more minutes, noting the care he took with even the smallest details. When he finished, the fence looked better than it had when Thomas first built it, straight, sturdy, and properly braced against the wind. "Thank you," she said as he gathered his tools. "What do I owe you?" Boone shook his head. "Nothing. Consider it a neighbor helping a neighbor." As he walked away, Clara remained by her newly repaired fence. Her mind churning with questions and possibilities she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Whatever Boone McGraw's past might hold, his actions today had been those of a thoughtful, skilled man who asked for nothing in return for his help. That evening, when Lucy discovered the repaired fence, her excitement was palpable. "He came back," she exclaimed, running her small hands along the smooth wood. "I knew he was good, Mama. I just knew it." Clara found herself without a ready response to her daughter's triumph. The fence stood as solid evidence that perhaps first impressions, both good and bad, weren't always the whole story. The sewing thimble felt heavier than usual on Clara's finger as she worked on Mayor Wilson's wife's elaborate dinner dress 3 days later. Through her window, she could see Boone McGraw across the street, loading supplies from Miller's General Store onto his horse. He had been staying at the boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher had mentioned during her visit yesterday, paying his rent promptly and causing no trouble despite the whispered concerns of some townspeople. Clara's measured approach to life, careful stitches, planned meals, the controlled emotions felt increasingly fragile as she watched the tall stranger navigate the suspicious glances and nervous conversations that followed him through town. She had spent 2 years building a life based on self-reliance and cautious interaction with others, but Boone's presence seemed to highlight the limitations of that approach. "Mama, there's a leak in the roof above my bed," Lucy announced, appearing in the doorway with damp hair and an apologetic expression. "It dripped on me all night." Clara set down her needle. With a sigh, she tried to hide from her daughter. The roof had been showing signs of weakness for months, but she had hoped it would last through the winter. Roof repairs required not just skill but strength and equipment she didn't possess, and the cost of hiring someone from the next town over would strain their already tight budget. "We'll put a bucket under it for now," Clara said, forcing optimism into her voice. "And maybe I can ask Mr. Peterson if he knows someone who could help." Lucy nodded but didn't move from the doorway. "Boone would know how to fix it," she said with the casual confidence that had become her signature whenever the subject of their mysterious helper arose. "Lucy, I'm just saying, Mama. He fixed our fence so nice and straight, and he didn't want any money for it. Maybe he likes fixing things." Before Clara could formulate a response that balanced honesty with appropriate maternal caution, a knock at their front door interrupted the conversation. Clara found Boone McGraw standing on her small porch, hat in hand, and an uncertain expression on his weathered face. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said with careful formality, "I was wondering if I might speak with you for a moment." Clara stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind her to prevent Lucy from overhearing. The morning air carried the scent of autumn leaves and the distant smoke from the blacksmith's forge, familiar smells that somehow seemed sharper with Boone's imposing presence on her porch. "I heard in town that you might be having some trouble with your roof," he said without preamble. "I wanted to offer my help, if you'd be willing to accept it." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "People are talking about my household problems." "Mrs. Fletcher mentioned it to Pete Miller when she was buying supplies," Boone explained gently. "She seemed concerned about you and Lucy, trying to manage it alone." The revelation that her struggles were becoming public knowledge stung Clara's pride, but she recognized the genuine concern in Boone's voice. Mrs. Fletcher had been nothing but kind since Thomas's death, and her worry came from affection rather than gossip. "I appreciate the offer," Clara said carefully, "but I can't afford to pay what such work would be worth." "I'm not asking for payment," Boone replied. "I'm asking for the chance to help." Clara studied his face, searching for the ulterior motive that her practical nature insisted must exist. Men didn't offer help without expecting something in return, especially not to widows they barely knew. But Boone's expression remained steady and sincere, without the calculating look she had learned to recognize and distrust. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you want to help me?" Boone was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving past her to the mountains that rose beyond the town. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested the question had touched something deeper than casual neighborliness. "5 years ago, I left this town believing I was beyond redemption," he said slowly. "I've spent that time trying to figure out if I was right. Your daughter looked at me and saw something worth saving. Maybe helping you is my way of testing whether she might be right." The honesty in his answer was both disarming and troubling. Clara could see the genuine struggle in his eyes, the careful hope that seemed almost afraid to acknowledge itself. Whatever he had done in his past, he was clearly a man wrestling with questions of worth and redemption that she understood all too well. "Mr. McGraw," she began, then stopped as Lucy's voice carried through the door. "Mama, is that Boone? Can I say hello?" Before Clara could respond, the door opened and Lucy appeared, her face bright with excitement. She seemed to light up at the sight of the tall man on their porch, her previous instructions about staying away apparently forgotten in her enthusiasm. "Boone, did you come to visit? Are you going to fix our roof? It's leaking right over my bed, and Mama says we need someone strong to help." Clara felt mortification wash over her as Lucy's words revealed the extent of their domestic challenges to this relative stranger. But Boone's response surprised her instead of the awkward discomfort she expected. His face softened with what looked like genuine fondness for her outspoken daughter. "I was just discussing that possibility with your mama," he said seriously, as if Lucy were an adult partner in the conversation. "What do you think about having someone work on your roof?" "I think it would be wonderful," Lucy replied with characteristic directness. "And maybe while you're here you could stay for supper. Mama makes the best cornbread in all of Colorado Territory." Clara's embarrassment deepened, but she noticed that Boone didn't laugh at Lucy's invitation or treat it as a childish presumption. Instead, he looked to Clara with a question in his eyes, waiting for her response to her daughter's impromptu dinner invitation. "Lucy, that's not I mean. Mr. McGraw probably has other obligations." Clara stammered, caught between her daughter's enthusiasm and her own uncertainty about encouraging this growing connection. "Actually," Boone said quietly, "I can't remember the last time I had a home-cooked meal. If you wouldn't mind the company, I'd consider it an honor." The formal way he phrased the request made it clear that he understood the significance of being invited into their home. This wasn't just about supper, it was about trust, about taking the first tentative step toward the kind of connection that Lucy seemed determined to foster. Clara looked between her daughter's hopeful face and Boone's carefully controlled expression, feeling the weight of a decision that seemed far more momentous than its simple surface suggested. She thought about the leaking roof, the broken fence that now stood straight and strong, and the careful loneliness that had shaped her life for the past 2 years. "Supper is at 6, she heard herself say, the words emerging before her cautious nature could stop them. Nothing fancy, just family cooking. The smile that spread across Lucy's face was radiant, while Boone's expression showed something that might have been relief mixed with gratitude. "I'll finish the roof work first," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "And thank you, Mrs. Whitmore, for the chance." As Clara watched him walk toward his horse to retrieve his tools, she wondered if she had just made a wise decision or opened the door to complications she wasn't prepared to handle. But the sound of Lucy's excited chatter about their dinner guest and the prospect of sleeping in a dry bed made her think that perhaps some risks were worth taking, even if their outcome remained uncertain. The drawing lay forgotten on the kitchen table, its crayon lines depicting 3 figures standing in front of a small house, a woman in a blue dress, a tall man in brown, and a little girl between them, all holding hands. Lucy had worked on it for most of the afternoon while Boone repaired their roof, the sound of his hammer providing a steady rhythm to her artistic endeavors. "Look what I made," Lucy announced as Clara prepared supper, holding up the paper with obvious pride. "It's our family picture." Clara's hands stilled on the cornbread she was mixing, her eyes taking in the careful way Lucy had drawn them all together. The little girl in the picture wore a bright smile, and even the tall figure that clearly represented Boone had been given happy eyes and a gentle expression. "It's very nice, sweetheart," Clara said carefully, "but you know that Mr. McGraw isn't actually part of our family, don't you?" Lucy tilted her head with the considering expression she wore when processing complex adult concepts. "Not yet," she agreed. "But he could be, couldn't he, if you liked each other enough?" Before Clara could formulate an appropriate response to this observation, the sound of boots on their front porch announced Boone's completion of his work. Clara smoothed her apron and checked her reflection in the window, surprised by the nervous flutter in her stomach. It had been so long since she had cooked for anyone other than Lucy that she found herself second-guessing every decision, from the menu to her choice of dress. "Something smells wonderful," Boone said as Clara opened the door to his knock. He had cleaned up at the pump behind the house, she noticed, and his dark hair was still damp from washing. The formal courtesy of his manner couldn't quite hide the genuine appreciation in his voice. "It's nothing special," Clara replied, stepping aside to let him enter their small home. "Just cornbread and stew." But as Boone removed his hat and looked around their modest living space, Clara saw her home through his eyes, the carefully tended furniture, the wild flowers Lucy had picked that morning, arranged in a mason jar, the warm light from the oil lamps that made everything feel cozy and welcoming. It might not be grand, but it was clean and comfortable, filled with the evidence of love and care. "It's been a long time since I've been in a real home," Boone said quietly, his gaze lingering on the family photographs that Clara had arranged on the mantelpiece. "You've made something beautiful here." The sincerity in his voice made Clara's chest tight with unexpected emotion. She realized that she had grown so accustomed to thinking of their circumstances as reduced and challenging that she had forgotten to appreciate the warmth and stability she had created for Lucy. "Boone, look!" Lucy bounced up from the table, clutching her drawing. "I made a picture of us being a family. Do you like it?" Clara held her breath as Boone knelt down to study Lucy's artwork with the serious attention it deserved. His weathered hands were gentle as he held the paper, and Clara saw something shift in his expression as he took in the hopeful scene Lucy had created. "It's a fine picture," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "You're quite an artist, Miss Lucy." "The tall one is you," Lucy explained unnecessarily, pointing to the brown figure with obvious pride. "I made you smile because I think you look nicer when you smile, instead of looking sad all the time." Boone's eyes flicked up to meet Clara's over Lucy's head, and she saw a vulnerability there that he usually kept carefully hidden. "Maybe I just needed something to smile about," he said softly. Supper proceeded with less awkwardness than Clara had feared. Boone's table manners were careful and respectful, and he seemed genuinely interested in Lucy's chatter about her lessons and her plans for their small garden. Clara found herself relaxing despite her initial nervousness, drawn in by the easy way he interacted with her daughter and the thoughtful questions he asked about their daily life. "Do you have any children of your own, Boone?" Lucy asked with her characteristic directness as Clara served the cornbread. Clara tensed, recognizing the personal nature of the question, but Boone answered without hesitation. "No, I don't," he said simply. "I've never been married." "Why not?" Lucy pressed, apparently finding this puzzling. "You're nice and strong, and you know how to fix things. Those seem like good things for a husband." "Lucy," Clara warned gently, but Boone held up a hand to indicate he didn't mind the question. "I suppose I never found the right person," he said, his eyes meeting Clara's briefly before returning to Lucy. "And for a long time, I wasn't the kind of man who deserved a family. But you could be now," Lucy said with the simple logic that cuts straight to the heart of complex matters. "People can change if they want to. Mama says that's what growing up means, learning from your mistakes and doing better." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at having her words quoted back in this context, but she noticed that Boone's expression had grown thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. "Your mama is a wise woman," he said seriously. "What else does she teach you?" Lucy launched into an enthusiastic recitation of her lessons, from reading and arithmetic to practical skills like cooking and mending. As Clara listened to her daughter's account of their daily routine, she became aware of how full and purposeful their life together had become, despite the absence of Thomas and the challenges they faced. "You're doing a remarkable job with her," Boone said quietly, as Lucy excused herself to fetch her reader to show him her progress. "I'm doing my best," Clara replied, the standard response she gave to such compliments. "Though some days I worry it's not enough. It shows in everything about her," Boone said, his voice carrying a conviction that made Clara look up from her plate. Her confidence, her kindness, the way she sees the best in people, those things come from being loved well. The simple observation touched something deep in Clara's heart. So much of her energy went into the practical aspects of raising Lucy alone that she sometimes lost sight of the emotional foundation she was building. To hear it recognized and valued by someone whose opinion was beginning to matter to her meant more than she could easily express. "She's the best part of everything I am," Clara said softly, watching Lucy rummage through her book box in the corner. "I would do anything to protect her." "That's clear," Boone replied, "and it's one of the things I most admire about you." The words hung between them, charged with meaning that went beyond simple politeness. Clara felt something shift in the careful distance she had maintained, a recognition that whatever was happening between them had moved beyond neighborly assistance into something more personal and potentially dangerous. As the evening progressed, Clara found herself stealing glances at Boone as he listened patiently to Lucy's reading, his large hands gentle as he helped her sound out difficult words. There was something deeply appealing about seeing this big, intimidating man show such tender care for her daughter, and Clara had to keep reminding herself that appearances could be deceiving. When Lucy finally succumbed to the yawns she had been fighting, Clara carried her off to bed while Boone waited respectfully in the main room. As she tucked her daughter in and listened to her excited whispers about their wonderful dinner guest, Clara found herself wondering if she was being wise or foolish to allow this connection to deepen. "He likes us, doesn't he, Mama?" Lucy asked sleepily as Clara kissed her goodnight. "I think he does," Clara admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "And you like him too, don't you?" Lucy's blue eyes were bright with hope, even as sleep tugged at her. Clara hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Yes, I think I do. But liking someone and building a life with them are very different things, sweetheart." "But it's a start," Lucy said with satisfaction, settling deeper into her pillow. "Papa always said the best things start with liking each other." When Clara returned to the main room, she found Boone standing by the mantelpiece, studying the photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day. The expression on his face was unreadable, but there was something almost reverent in the way he looked at the image of their happiness. "He looks like he was a good man," Boone said without turning around. "He was," Clara replied, moving to stand beside him. "The best man I've ever known." Boone nodded slowly, then stepped back from the photograph. "I should go. Thank you for supper, and for," he gestured vaguely at the warm room around them, "for letting me remember what home feels like." As Clara walked him to the door, she found herself reluctant to end the evening. The house would feel empty after his presence, and she realized how much she had enjoyed having adult conversation and Lucy's obvious joy in their expanded dinner table. "Mr. McGraw," she said as he reached for his hat. "Boone, would you, that is, if you're still in town on Sunday, you'd be welcome to join us for church. If you'd like." The invitation surprised them both. Clara had acted on impulse, moved by the loneliness she had glimpsed beneath his careful courtesy and her own growing desire for his company. "I'm not sure I'd be welcome in church," Boone said carefully. "My reputation might make others uncomfortable. Then, they need to remember that church is supposed to be for sinners seeking redemption," Clara replied with more firmness than she had intended. "Besides, Lucy would be disappointed if you didn't come. She's already planning to introduce you to everyone." A smile tugged at the corner of Boone's mouth, the first genuine smile Clara had seen from him. "In that case, I'd be honored to escort you both to church." As Clara watched him walk away into the darkness, she touched the simple gold band she still wore and wondered if Thomas would approve of the feelings beginning to stir in her heart. The drawing Lucy had made lay on the kitchen table, its crayon family looking back at her with hopeful smiles, and Clara found herself wondering if such happiness might actually be possible, or if she was fooling herself about the kind of man Boone McGraw really was. The gun belt lay hidden beneath loose floorboards in Boone's room at the boarding house, wrapped in oiled cloth, like a secret too dangerous to forget but too heavy to carry. He had worn those weapons for 15 years, through raids and robberies, and the kind of violence that left permanent stains on a man's soul. Now they felt like relics from another life, though he knew better than to believe he could simply abandon what he had been. Lucy discovered them by accident on Thursday afternoon while playing hide-and-seek around the house during one of Boone's visits. She had been seeking the perfect hiding spot when her small foot caught on the loose board in the back porch, where Boone had been working on replacing some rotted planking. The board lifted, revealing the carefully wrapped bundle beneath. "Boone, what's this?" Lucy called out, her natural curiosity overcoming any sense that she might be trespassing. She had already unwrapped part of the cloth before Boone could reach her, exposing the worn leather and cold metal of the holster. Clara arrived at the sound of Lucy's excited voice, stopping short when she saw what her daughter had uncovered. The gun belt lay partially exposed in Lucy's small hands, its deadly purpose unmistakable even to someone with limited experience of violence. The careful peace of their afternoon shattered like glass. "Lucy, put that down," Clara said sharply, her protective instincts flaring at the sight of weapons so close to her child. But Lucy, with the fearless curiosity of childhood, was already examining the intricate tooling on the leather. "It's beautiful," she said admiringly. "Look at all the flowers carved into it. Did you make this, Boone?" Boone knelt beside her, his movements careful and controlled, despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. "I did," he said quietly, gently taking the gun belt from her hands and rewrapping it. "A long time ago, when I was a different person." "Why do you have guns?" Lucy asked with her characteristic directness. "Are you a sheriff like Mr. Bradley?" The innocent question hung in the air between them, while Clara struggled with how to handle this moment. She could see the internal battle playing out across Boone's weathered features, the desire to protect Lucy's innocence, warring with his commitment to honesty. "No, Lucy, I'm not a sheriff," Boone said finally, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was revealing. "I used to be an outlaw. That means I broke the law and hurt people, and I carried those guns while I did it." Clara felt her heart sink as the reality of Boone's past was laid bare. She had known there were serious problems in his history, but hearing him admit to being an outlaw to Lucy no less made the danger feel immediate and real. Lucy, however, absorbed this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance that characterized her approach to most adult revelations. "But you don't do that anymore," she said, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. "No, I don't," Boone confirmed, carefully placing the wrapped bundle back beneath the loose board. "But some people find it hard to believe that someone can change so completely." "Why?" Lucy asked, genuinely puzzled. "People change all the time. I used to cry when Mama left me with Mrs. Henderson, but now I don't, because I learned that she always comes back." The simple comparison between her childhood fears and Boone's violent past would have been laughable if it weren't so painfully innocent. Clara saw Boone's throat work as he struggled with how to explain the weight of adult choices to a child who still believed in the possibility of complete redemption. "Some changes are bigger than others," he said carefully, "and some mistakes hurt people so badly that it's hard for them to forgive, even when the person is truly sorry." Lucy considered this seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration. "But you are sorry, aren't you? I can tell because you get that sad look in your eyes sometimes, like when you think no one is watching." Clara felt her chest tighten at her daughter's astute observation. Lucy had always been perceptive about people's emotions, but her ability to see past Boone's careful exterior to the regret beneath was both touching and troubling. "Yes, Lucy, I'm very sorry for the things I did," Boone said, his voice rough with emotion. "But being sorry doesn't erase the harm I caused." "Maybe not," Lucy agreed, "but it means you won't do those things again. And isn't that what matters most?" The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching at speed. Clara looked up to see 3 riders coming toward their house, their pace and bearing suggesting urgent business rather than a social call. Boone was on his feet instantly, his entire demeanor shifting from gentle conversation to alert readiness. "Clara, take Lucy inside," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. "Lock the door and don't come out until I tell you." "Who are they?" Clara asked, though she was already moving toward Lucy, her protective instincts responding to the tension in Boone's voice. "I don't know," Boone replied, but Clara could see the lie in the rigid set of his shoulders. "But I need to handle this." As Clara hustled Lucy toward the house, she heard her daughter's voice drifting back toward Boone. "You won't go away, will you? Even if those men are trouble?" Boone's answer was too quiet for Clara to hear, but she saw him nod to Lucy before turning his full attention to the approaching strangers. From the kitchen window, Clara watched as the 3 men dismounted near their front gate. They were rough-looking individuals, the kind of men who carried violence like a familiar tool, and she could see the way they studied Boone with recognition rather than curiosity. The conversation was brief and heated, though Clara couldn't make out the words. She could see Boone's careful stillness, the way he held himself ready for action while trying to project calm authority. When one of the strangers gestured toward the house, Boone stepped between them and the building, his meaning unmistakable. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the three men remounted and rode away, leaving Boone standing alone in the yard. Clara watched him remain motionless for a long time, his head bowed, as if gathering himself before turning back toward the house. When Clara opened the door to his knock, she could see the cost of the encounter in the new lines around his eyes, and the careful way he held himself. "They're gone," he said simply, "but they'll be back." "Who were they?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Men from my past," Boone replied, confirming her fears. "Men who think I owe them something." Lucy appeared at Clara's elbow, having ignored her mother's instructions to stay in her room. "Are you in trouble, Boone?" Boone knelt down to meet Lucy's concerned gaze, his weathered hands gentle as he took her small ones in his. "I might be, little one, and that means I might need to leave soon, to keep you and your mama safe." "No." Lucy's protest was immediate and fierce. "You can't leave. We're supposed to be a family." Clara saw the pain that flashed across Boone's face at Lucy's distress, the way her innocent faith in their future together cut him more deeply than any threat from dangerous men ever could. "Sometimes protecting the people you love means staying away from them," Boone said gently, "even when it's the last thing you want to do." As Clara watched this gentle giant try to explain adult realities to her heartbroken daughter, she realized that the choice was no longer about whether she could trust Boone McGraw with their hearts. The choice was whether she would fight for the family that Lucy, and increasingly, she herself desperately wanted, or whether she would let fear drive away the first man in 2 years who had made her believe in the possibility of love again. The blood-stained letter arrived on Friday morning, delivered by a nervous boy from the telegraph office who looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else. Clara found it slipped under her door when she rose to start breakfast, the envelope bearing Boone's name in a cramped, urgent handwriting that spoke of desperation and fear. She stood in her kitchen, holding the letter and wrestling with the moral implications of what she was contemplating. The envelope was sealed but damaged, one corner torn and stained with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Common decency demanded she deliver it to Boone unopened, but maternal instinct whispered that her daughter's safety might depend on knowing what threats were circling their small family. Lucy solved her dilemma by appearing in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. "Is that for Boone?" she asked, studying the envelope with the frank curiosity that characterized all her observations. "Yes, it is," Clara replied, making her decision. "We should take it to him." They found Boone at the boarding house, sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee and the careful alertness of a man expecting trouble. His eyes immediately fixed on the envelope in Clara's hands, and she saw recognition flicker across his features before his expression closed into careful neutrality. "This came for you," Clara said, extending the letter with hands that trembled slightly. It looks like there might be blood on it." Boone took the envelope gently, his fingers tracing the stained corner with a familiarity that suggested he had seen such things before. "Thank you for bringing it," he said quietly. "You should probably go home now." "Is someone hurt?" Lucy asked, studying the stains with scientific interest rather than fear. "Did someone send you a message about being hurt?" Boone looked between Clara and Lucy, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. The letter felt heavy in his hands, weighted with more than paper and ink, and Clara could see the internal battle playing out across his weathered features. "Why don't you read it?" Clara heard herself say, the words emerging before her cautious nature could stop them. "We're already involved, aren't we? Those men yesterday. This letter, whatever's happening, it's not going to leave us alone just because we pretend not to know about it." Boone's eyes met hers over Lucy's head, and Clara saw something shift in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude for her practical acknowledgement of their situation. "You might not want to hear this," he warned quietly. "Let us decide that," Clara replied, settling beside him on the porch steps with Lucy between them. Boone opened the envelope with careful precision, unfolding pages that bore the same cramped handwriting and additional stains that definitely looked like blood. As he began to read, his face went pale beneath his weathered tan, and Clara saw his hands shake slightly before he consciously steadied them. "It's from Jake Morrison," Boone said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "He's dying, and he wanted to tell me the truth before he goes." "What truth?" Lucy asked with her characteristic directness. Boone was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words shattered everything she thought she knew about their situation. "Your husband didn't die of fever, Clara," he said, not looking at her as he spoke. "He was murdered. By my gang. By men I rode with for 5 years." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making the world tilt sickeningly around her. She heard Lucy's sharp intake of breath, felt her daughter's small hand reach for hers, but everything seemed to be happening at a great distance. "That's impossible," Clara whispered, though even as she spoke the words, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began clicking into place. Thomas's sudden illness, the way it had progressed so rapidly, the strange men who had been asking questions in town around that time. "Jake writes that they came here looking for me," Boone continued, his voice flat with controlled anguish. "I had left the gang 6 months earlier, disappeared into the mountains, and they were trying to track me down. Thomas was working late at the livery stable, and when they questioned him about my whereabouts, he told them he didn't know anything." Clara's mind reeled as she tried to process this information. Thomas had known Boone. How was that possible? They didn't believe him. Boone went on, each word seeming to cost him tremendous effort. "They thought he was protecting me, so they poisoned him, made it look like fever, so no one would investigate too closely." "But why would they think Papa was protecting you?" Lucy asked, her voice small and confused. "You didn't even know us then." Boone finally looked at Clara, and she saw anguish in his eyes that went far deeper than guilt over his former associate's actions. "Because I had been watching your family for months," he said quietly, "coming to town occasionally, seeing your mother from a distance, and your father knew about it." Clara felt the world shift again, reality rearranging itself around this impossible revelation. "You were watching me? I had seen you once, 2 years before that, when I was in town on gang business," Boone explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were hanging laundry behind your house, singing to yourself, and you looked so peaceful, so good. I couldn't forget you. I started coming back, just to see you and your family, to watch what a real life looked like." The admission hung between them like a confession and an accusation combined. Clara struggled to reconcile this revelation with everything she thought she knew about her life with Thomas, about their simple happiness and their plans for the future. "Thomas caught me watching one day," Boone continued. "Instead of running me off or calling the sheriff, he invited me for coffee. We talked for hours. He was everything good that I wasn't. Kind, honest, devoted to his family. He knew what I was, but he saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself." "Papa talked to you?" Lucy's voice was filled with wonder rather than accusation. "He never told us." "He didn't want to worry your mother," Boone replied, glancing at Clara with careful eyes. "But he understood that I was trying to change, trying to find a way out of the life I'd been living. He said that everyone deserved a chance at redemption if they were truly willing to work for it." Clara's heart clenched as she recognized Thomas's words, his philosophy about second chances and the possibility of change. It was exactly what he would have said, exactly how he would have responded to someone seeking a better path. "When I left the gang, Thomas was the only person who knew where I was going," Boone said. "He promised to keep my secret, and he died for it, because of me." The weight of this revelation settled over Clara like a shroud. Her husband hadn't died of natural causes. He had been murdered because of his kindness to a stranger, because of his belief in redemption and second chances. The grief she had carried for 2 years suddenly felt different, sharper, and more complex. "That's why you came back," she said, understanding flooding through her. "Not because of some coincidence, but because you knew. You knew what had happened to Thomas." Boone nodded, his eyes fixed on the letter in his hands. "Jake writes that the others are dead now, killed in various jobs gone wrong over the past 2 years. But their actions weigh on his conscience, and he wanted me to know the truth before he dies. He thought I deserved to know what my association with them had cost." Lucy, who had been listening with the intense concentration she brought to all serious adult conversations, suddenly spoke up. "So, you came back to tell us what really happened to Papa?" "I came back to see if there was anything I could do to make amends," Boone replied carefully, "though I know there's nothing that could ever balance the scales." Clara sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what she had learned. Thomas had been murdered. Boone had loved her from afar for years. Her husband had died because he chose to help a man seeking redemption. The simple narrative of her life had been completely rewritten in the space of a few minutes. "Does this change how you feel about us?" Lucy asked with the devastating directness that made Clara's heart ache. "Now that you've told us the truth?" Boone's expression softened as he looked at her daughter, and Clara saw the love there that he had been trying so hard to hide. "No, little one. If anything, it makes me realize how impossible it is for me to be part of your lives. I brought nothing but trouble to your family before, and I'm bringing it again now." "That's not true," Lucy said firmly. "You brought yourself, and that's good. Papa would have liked knowing that you came back to take care of us." Clara felt tears sting her eyes at her daughter's simple faith, her ability to see past the complexity and pain to the heart of what mattered. Thomas would indeed have wanted to know that Boone had returned to watch over them, that his sacrifice had not been meaningless. But as Clara looked at the blood-stained letter in Boone's hands and thought about the dangerous men who had visited yesterday, she realized that the truth, while liberating in some ways, had also made their situation far more perilous than she had imagined. Clara's husband's Bible lay open on the kitchen table, its worn pages revealing the pressed flower from their wedding bouquet that Thomas had saved between the verses about love and commitment. She traced the delicate petals with trembling fingers, trying to reconcile the man she had mourned with the man who had apparently befriended an outlaw and died for his kindness. 2 days had passed since Boone's revelation, 2 days during which Clara had struggled to process the magnitude of what she had learned. The quiet routine of her life, sewing, teaching Lucy, maintaining their small household, felt like an elaborate performance now. A careful dance around the explosive truth that had reordered everything she thought she knew about her past and her future. "Mama, you're staring at Papa's flower again," Lucy observed from her place at the table where she was practicing her letters. "You've been doing that a lot since Boone told us about what really happened." Clara closed the Bible gently, her wedding ring catching the morning light as she smoothed the worn leather cover. "I'm just trying to understand, sweetheart. It's difficult when you learn that someone you loved had secrets you never knew about." Lucy set down her pencil and regarded her mother with the serious expression she wore when processing complex adult emotions. "But they weren't bad secrets, were they? Papa was trying to help Boone become a better person. That sounds like something Papa would do." The simple wisdom in her daughter's words made Clara's chest tighten with a mixture of grief and pride. Lucy was right. Of course, Thomas's decision to help Boone was entirely consistent with the man she had married, the man who had always believed in the possibility of redemption and change. A knock at their door interrupted her thoughts, and Clara opened it to find Sheriff Bradley standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and worry lines creasing his forehead. Behind him stood Mayor Wilson and Doc Peterson, their faces grave with the kind of concern that suggested official business rather than a social call. Mrs. Whitmore, Sheriff Bradley began carefully, we need to talk to you about Boone McGraw. Clara's protective instincts flared immediately. What about him? May we come in? The sheriff asked, glancing meaningfully at Lucy, who was listening with obvious interest from the kitchen table. Clara stepped aside reluctantly, acutely aware that this conversation would change something fundamental about their situation. The three men arranged themselves awkwardly in her small living room, their presence making the space feel cramped and formal. We've had reports of suspicious men asking questions around town, Sheriff Bradley began, his voice carrying the weight of official concern. Men who seem to be looking for McGraw specifically. Doc here treated a man yesterday who'd been badly beaten, and before he died, he said something about old debts and settling scores. Clara felt her blood turn cold. Someone died? Jake Morrison, Doc Peterson confirmed quietly. He'd been tortured before someone left him on the outskirts of town. He lived long enough to tell me that men were coming for Boone and that innocent people might get hurt if they got in the way. Lucy had abandoned any pretense of working on her letters and was listening with wide eyes. Clara wanted to shield her from this conversation, but she also knew that their daughter needed to understand the danger they might be facing. What exactly are you asking me to do? Clara said carefully. Mayor Wilson leaned forward, his politician's manner evident even in these difficult circumstances. We're asking you to convince McGraw to leave town, Mrs. Whitmore, for everyone's safety, including his own. And why do you think I have any influence over his decisions? The three men exchanged glances that suggested Clara's relationship with Boone had not gone unnoticed by the community. Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat awkwardly. It's common knowledge that he's been helping around your place, ma'am, and that you've been welcoming to him despite his reputation. People figure if anyone could convince him to move on, it would be you. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication that her private business had become a matter of public discussion, but before she could respond, Lucy spoke up from her place at the table. Boone won't leave, she said with absolute conviction. He promised he wouldn't go away, and he keeps his promises. Little girl, you don't understand how dangerous this situation is, Mayor Wilson said with the condescending tone adults often used when they wanted to dismiss children's opinions. I understand that bad men want to hurt Boone because of things that happened a long time ago, Lucy replied, with dignity far beyond her years. And I understand that he's trying to protect us by staying away from our house. But running away won't solve anything. Papa used to say that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's scary. Clara felt a surge of pride at her daughter's courage, even as she worried about the implications of Lucy's determined loyalty to Boone. The men in her living room looked uncomfortable with being lectured by a 6-year-old, but Clara could see that Lucy's words had hit their mark. Mrs. Whitmore, Sheriff Bradley said, turning back to Clara with renewed urgency, I have to tell you that I'm not sure I can protect everyone if this situation escalates. Bitter Creek isn't equipped to handle the kind of violence that might be coming. Then maybe you should be asking how the town can help Boone instead of how to get rid of him. Clara found herself saying, surprising everyone, including herself, with the firmness in her voice. The silence that followed her statement was heavy with implication. Clara realized that she had just publicly taken sides in a conflict that could define not only her future, but the future of everyone in Bitter Creek. Mrs. Whitmore, Doc Peterson said gently, I understand that you've developed feelings for McGraw, but you have to think about Lucy's safety. I am thinking about Lucy's safety, Clara replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. And I'm also thinking about what kind of woman I want her to see when she looks at her mother. Do I want her to see someone who abandons people when they need help most, or someone who stands by those she cares about even when it's difficult? Lucy's face lit up with fierce pride, and Clara felt Thomas's presence in the room as surely as if he were standing beside her. She could almost hear his voice encouraging her to trust her instincts, to choose love over fear. The men asking questions aren't just looking for Boone, Clara continued, the pieces of a larger picture beginning to form in her mind. They're looking for people who might know where he is, people who might be helping him. That makes me and Lucy targets whether he stays or goes. Sheriff Bradley's expression grew troubled as he considered this observation. You might be right about that. Then our safety doesn't depend on Boone leaving, Clara said with growing conviction. It depends on resolving whatever conflict brought these men here in the first place. Mayor Wilson shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Whitmore, you're talking about vigilante justice. We can't officially sanction. I'm talking about protecting our community, Clara interrupted, her mother's protective instincts fully engaged now, and about standing by someone who's been trying to make amends for his past mistakes. A commotion outside interrupted their conversation, horses arriving at speed, followed by urgent voices and the sound of boots on wooden sidewalks. Sheriff Bradley was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his weapon as he peered through Clara's front window. "Speak of the devil," he muttered grimly. "Looks like our visitors have returned." Clara joined him at the window, her heart sinking as she saw 5 mounted men arranged in a loose semicircle in front of her house. They were rough-looking individuals, the kind of men who wore violence like a familiar coat, and their leader, a thin man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth, was studying her home with predatory interest. "Mrs. Whitmore," the leader called out, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "We'd like to have a word with you about your friend Boone McGraw." Lucy appeared at Clara's side, pressing close against her mother's skirts as she looked out at the threatening men. "They don't look very nice," she whispered. "No, they don't," Clara agreed, wrapping her arm around her daughter's shoulders, while her mind raced through possible responses to this confrontation. "I'm going out there," Sheriff Bradley said, checking his weapon. "You stay inside with the girl." But as Clara watched the sheriff prepare to face 5 dangerous men alone, she realized that this moment would define not only her own courage, but the kind of future she was willing to fight for. The Bible on her kitchen table held the pressed flower from her wedding, a symbol of the love she had built with Thomas and lost too soon. But it also held the promise of new beginnings, of love worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. "No," she said quietly, her decision crystallizing with surprising clarity. "We go out there together, all of us. They want to intimidate us by dividing us, but they can't intimidate an entire community standing together." Lucy looked up at her with shining eyes. "Are we going to fight for Boone?" Clara thought about Thomas's belief in second chances, about Boone's gentle hands teaching Lucy to read, about the family drawing on their kitchen table that depicted a hope worth defending. "Yes, sweetheart," she said firmly. "We're going to fight for our family." Lucy clutched her wooden horse toy against her chest as Clara stepped onto the front porch, the carved figure that Boone had whittled for her during one of his evening visits, serving as both comfort and reminder of what they were fighting to protect. The toy's smooth surfaces bore the evidence of careful craftsmanship and patient love, qualities that seemed precious and fragile in the face of the 5 armed men waiting in their yard. The leader of the group, a man whose lean build and pale eyes spoke of calculated cruelty, smiled at Clara's appearance with the kind of satisfaction that made her skin crawl. Behind him, his companions sat their horses with the easy confidence of men accustomed to intimidating their way through problems, their weapons visible and their intentions clear. "Mrs. Whitmore, I presume," the leader said with mocking courtesy, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that felt more like a threat than a greeting. "I'm Cole Brennan, and these are my associates. We're looking for an old friend of ours, and we have reason to believe you might know where to find him." Clara felt Sheriff Bradley move slightly behind her, his presence reassuring even as she understood that they were badly outnumbered. Mayor Wilson and Doc Peterson flanked them, their civilian bearing obvious, but their courage evident in their willingness to stand with her. "I'm not in the habit of discussing my acquaintances with strangers," Clara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Especially strangers who ride into town making demands. Brennan's smile widened, revealing teeth stained with tobacco and neglect. "Oh, but Boone McGraw isn't just any acquaintance, is he? Word around town is that you've been playing house with him, getting mighty cozy for a respectable widow woman." The crude implication in his words made Clara's cheeks burn with anger rather than embarrassment. Behind her, she heard Sheriff Bradley's sharp intake of breath and felt Lucy press closer against her skirts. "My personal relationships are none of your concern," Clara said firmly, lifting her chin in a gesture of defiance that she hoped masked her fear. "See, that's where you're wrong," Brennan replied, his mock courtesy evaporating to reveal the menace beneath. "Boone owes us something, and we intend to collect. Now, you can tell us where he is and save everyone a lot of trouble, or we can start making things unpleasant for you and your little girl until you see reason." The threat against Lucy galvanized Clara's courage in a way that concern for her own safety never could. She stepped forward slightly, placing herself more completely between the dangerous men and her daughter. "Get off my property," she said, her voice carrying an authority she didn't know she possessed. "You have no right to threaten my child." Brennan laughed, the sound harsh and unpleasant in the morning air. "Rights don't mean much out here, lady. What means something is power, and right now, we've got all of it." "I wouldn't be so sure about that," came a new voice from the corner of the house. Clara's heart leaped as Boone stepped into view, his tall figure moving with the controlled grace of a predator. He had armed himself. She noticed the gun belt she had seen hidden beneath the floorboards now rode low on his hips, and his hands hung loose and ready at his sides. Well, Brennan said, his pleasure at this development evident in his voice. "Look what crawled out of the woodwork. Boys, it looks like our old friend decided to come home after all." Boone's eyes flicked briefly to Clara and Lucy before focusing entirely on the mounted men. "Let them go, Brennan. Your quarrel is with me." "Oh, I don't think so," Brennan replied, his hand resting casually on his pistol grip. "You see, these good people have been harboring a wanted man. That makes them accessories, doesn't it, boys?" The other riders chuckled appreciatively at their leader's logic, but Clara noticed that their attention was now divided between Boone and the group on the porch. She could see the tactical assessment happening in their eyes, the calculation of angles and advantages. "Nobody here has done anything wrong," Boone said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had faced such situations many times before. "This is between you and me, just like it always was." Lucy stepped out from behind Clara's skirts, still clutching her wooden horse, but lifting her chin with a courage that made Clara's heart soar and sink simultaneously. "You're the bad men who hurt Papa," she said clearly, her young voice carrying across the yard with devastating accuracy. Brennan's expression shifted to one of genuine surprise. "Well, I'll be damned. The little girl knows more than she should." He leaned forward in his saddle, studying Lucy with renewed interest. "Tell me, little one, what exactly do you think you know about your papa?" "I know you killed him because he wouldn't tell you where Boone was," Lucy replied with the fearless honesty that had always been her defining characteristic. "And I know that makes you murderers." The word hung in the air like an accusation and a challenge combined. Clara saw Brennan's face darken with anger at being called out by a child, while his men shifted nervously in their saddles. "Careful, little girl," Brennan said, his voice turning cold and dangerous. "Children should be seen and not heard, especially when grown men are conducting business." "Leave her alone," Boone said sharply, taking a step forward that brought him closer to the mounted men. "She's just a child. She doesn't understand what she's saying." But Lucy, with the stubborn determination she had inherited from both parents, wasn't finished. "I understand perfectly," she declared, looking directly at Brennan with eyes that blazed with righteous anger. "You're bad men who hurt good people, and Boone is going to stop you." Clara wanted to pull her daughter back, to shield her from this confrontation, but she also felt a fierce pride in Lucy's courage. Her little girl was standing up for what was right, just as Thomas would have done. "Is that so?" Brennan asked, his attention shifting back to Boone with predatory interest. "And just how do you plan to stop us, McGraw? There are 5 of us, and 1 of you." "Maybe," Boone replied calmly, "but I'm not the same man who rode with you 5 years ago. I've learned a few things about what's worth fighting for." As if summoned by his words, more figures began appearing around the yard. Pete Miller emerged from behind the general store across the street, a shotgun in his hands. Mrs. Fletcher stepped out of her boarding house with a rifle that looked well-maintained despite her grandmotherly appearance. Doc Peterson moved to stand beside Sheriff Bradley, while Mayor Wilson positioned himself protectively near Clara and Lucy. "Looks like the whole town's decided to have a party," Brennan observed, but Clara could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice as he realized that the odds were no longer so clearly in his favor. "Bitter Creek takes care of its own," Sheriff Bradley said firmly, his badge catching the morning sun as he stepped forward. "And Boone McGraw is one of ours now." Clara felt tears sting her eyes at the simple declaration of community support. These people, who had watched her struggle through widowhood and had seen Boone's efforts to build a new life, were willing to stand with them against very real danger. The standoff stretched taut as both sides assessed their positions. Brennan's men were professional gunfighters, Clara realized, but they were also outnumbered by people fighting to protect their home and their neighbors. The mathematics of violence were complex, involving more than just numbers and weapons. "This doesn't have to end badly for anyone," Boone said, his voice carrying across the yard with calm authority. "You can ride away now, forget you ever found me, and no one gets hurt." Brennan's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You always were too soft, McGraw. That's why you never understood what it took to survive in our line of work." His hand moved toward his weapon. "But don't worry, we'll make sure your new family understands exactly what happens to people who cross us." The town bell began to ring, its bronze voice carrying across Bitter Creek with urgent summons that brought more people running from their homes and businesses. Sarah Mitchell appeared with her husband from the telegraph office, while the blacksmith emerged from his forge with a hammer that could serve as weapon or tool. Even elderly Mrs. Henderson arrived, moving with surprising speed for a woman of her years. Clara watched in amazement as her small community transformed before her eyes. Neighbors she had known for years, revealing reserves of courage she had never suspected. These were not gunfighters or lawmen, but shopkeepers and farmers, seamstresses and teachers who had decided that some things were worth defending regardless of the personal cost. "Well, I'll be damned," Brennan muttered, his confident swagger beginning to falter as he realized that half the town had mobilized against him. "Looks like our old friend has made quite an impression on the locals." Lucy stepped forward again, still clutching her wooden horse but moving with the fearless determination that Clara recognized as pure Thomas Whitmore. "They're not just locals," she announced clearly. "They're our family, and families protect each other." The simple truth in her daughter's words hit Clara with stunning force. This was what Thomas had tried to build when he brought them to Bitter Creek, not just a place to live, but a community bound together by shared values and mutual care. Lucy understood something that had taken Clara years to fully grasp. Family wasn't just about blood relations, but about the people who chose to stand with you when standing was difficult. Boone's expression softened as he looked at Lucy, and Clara saw the exact moment when his careful control cracked slightly, revealing the depth of his love for them both. "That's right, little one," he said quietly, "and I won't let anyone hurt our family." Brennan's face twisted with ugly rage at this display of community solidarity. "Enough of this sentimental garbage," he snarled, his hand moving decisively toward his weapon. "Time to show these good people what happens when they interfere in business that doesn't concern them." The moment stretched like a held breath before exploding into violence. Brennan's draw was fast and practiced, but Boone was faster, his movements flowing with the deadly precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of survival. The sound of gunfire cracked across the morning air, sharp and final. Brennan's shot went wide as Boone's bullet found its mark, spinning the outlaw leader from his saddle to land heavily in the dust of Clara's yard. The other four men hesitated for a crucial second, caught between their professional instincts and the sudden realization that their leader was down. That second of hesitation was all the townspeople needed. Pete Miller's shotgun boomed, taking down one of the mounted men, while Mrs. Fletcher's rifle spoke with surprising accuracy. Sheriff Bradley and the other men added their fire to the chaos, filling the air with smoke and noise and the sharp scent of gunpowder. Lucy pressed close against Clara's side, her wooden horse forgotten as she watched the battle unfold with wide eyes. Clara wrapped her arms around her daughter, shielding her as much as possible while trying to track the action through the swirling smoke. When the gunfire finally ceased, 3 of Brennan's men lay still in the yard, while the remaining 2 had thrown down their weapons in surrender. Boone stood in the center of it all, his smoking pistol still in his hand, blood trickling from a graze on his left arm but otherwise unharmed. The sudden silence felt almost as violent as the gunfire had been. Clara's ears rang as she looked around at her neighbors, seeing the same stunned realization on their faces that they had just participated in something that would change their community forever. "Is everyone all right?" Doc Peterson called out, already moving toward the wounded with his medical bag in hand. A chorus of affirmative responses rose from the townspeople, though Clara noticed that several were shaking from the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. Mrs. Fletcher was already reloading her rifle with practiced efficiency, while Pete Miller kept his shotgun trained on the 2 surviving outlaws. Lucy suddenly broke free from Clara's protective embrace and ran toward Boone, her small legs carrying her across the yard with desperate speed. "Boone, you're bleeding!" Clara's heart stopped as she watched her daughter throw herself against the tall man's legs, apparently unconcerned about the weapon still in his hand or the bodies scattered around the yard. Boone carefully holstered his pistol before kneeling down to Lucy's level, his weathered face gentle despite the violence that had just ended. "Just a scratch, little one," he said softly, allowing her to examine the shallow wound on his arm. "Nothing that won't heal." "I was scared they were going to hurt you," Lucy admitted, her voice muffled against his shoulder as she hugged him fiercely. "I was scared they were going to take you away from us." "Never," Boone promised, his voice rough with emotion as he returned her embrace. "I'm not going anywhere, Lucy. Not ever again." Clara approached them slowly, her legs unsteady from the shock of what had just happened. The yard that had been her peaceful sanctuary was now marked by violence and death, but somehow it felt more truly hers than ever before. They had fought for it, bled for it, chosen it over safety and comfort. Sheriff Bradley was already organizing the cleanup, directing the surviving outlaws toward the jail, while Doc Peterson tended to the wounded. The community that had stood together in crisis was now working together in its aftermath, proving that the bonds forged in desperation could endure in peace. "Is it over?" Clara asked quietly as she reached Boone and Lucy. Boone stood slowly, lifting Lucy into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. "It's over," he confirmed, his eyes meeting Clara's with a certainty that made her heart race. "The past is finally buried, and the future, well, the future is ours to write." The new wedding ring set lay nestled in a small velvet box on Clara's kitchen table, the simple gold bands catching the morning light that streamed through windows that no longer needed to be watched for dangerous riders. 3 months had passed since the confrontation that had changed everything, 3 months during which Bitter Creek had settled into a new rhythm that included Boone McGraw as a permanent and welcome resident. Clara touched the rings gently, marveling at how they represented both an ending and a beginning. The simple band she had worn for 2 years in memory of Thomas now rested in her jewelry box, honored but no longer needed as a symbol of her identity. These new rings spoke of different promises, not the passionate love of youth, but the deeper, more complex affection that grew from shared trials and mutual respect. "Mama, are you nervous about getting married?" Lucy asked from her place at the table where she was working on a new drawing, this one depicting the wedding ceremony they were planning for the following week. "You look like you might be nervous." Clara smiled at her daughter's perceptive observation. "A little," she admitted. "But it's the good kind of nervous, like when you're excited about something wonderful that's about to happen." Lucy nodded sagely, adding careful details to the small church she had drawn. "Boone says he's nervous too, but he smiles every time someone mentions the wedding. I think he's happy nervous, just like you." The past 3 months had brought revelations that continued to amaze Clara. Boone's integration into their community had proceeded with surprising smoothness, aided by the respect he had earned during the confrontation with Brennan's gang. His skills as a carpenter and handyman had made him invaluable to many of the townspeople, while his gentle manner with children had endeared him to the mothers who had initially viewed him with suspicion. Most importantly, his relationship with Lucy had blossomed into the father-daughter bond that Clara's little girl had dreamed of since her innocent proposal on that first day. Boone had proven himself to be everything Lucy had somehow sensed. He could be patient, protective, and endlessly willing to engage with her curiosity about the world. "Mrs. Whitmore?" The voice from the front porch belonged to Sarah Mitchell, who had become Clara's closest confidant during the wedding preparations. "Are you ready for the final fitting?" Clara opened the door to find Sarah holding the blue dress that would serve as Clara's wedding gown, not the elaborate white creation that tradition might have dictated, but a practical yet beautiful garment that reflected the mature nature of this second chance at love. "Lucy, why don't you show Sarah your newest drawing while I try this on?" Clara suggested, grateful for the distraction that would allow her a few moments to compose herself. As she changed into the dress in her bedroom, Clara caught sight of herself in the mirror and was surprised by what she saw. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the grieving widow who had struggled through each day 3 months ago. This woman's eyes held hope instead of resigned endurance, and her face showed the kind of peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The dress fit perfectly, its simple lines flattering without being ostentatious. Sarah had suggested the addition of lace at the collar and cuffs, small touches that elevated the garment while maintaining its practical elegance. It was a dress for a woman who understood that true beauty came from confidence and joy rather than elaborate decoration. "You look beautiful, Mama," Lucy declared when Clara emerged from the bedroom. "Boone is going to think you're the prettiest bride in all of Colorado Territory." "I think he's more interested in the person wearing the dress than the dress itself," Clara replied, smoothing the blue fabric with hands that no longer shook when she thought about the future. A knock at the door announced another visitor, and Clara opened it to find Boone himself standing on the porch with a small package in his hands and an expression of careful uncertainty on his weathered face. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said formally, though his eyes took in her appearance with obvious appreciation. "I brought something for Lucy." "Another present?" Lucy exclaimed, abandoning her drawing to examine the wrapped package. "What is it?" "Something I've been working on," Boone replied, settling into the chair that had become his customary seat during these family gatherings. "Open it and see." Lucy's excited unwrapping revealed a beautifully carved wooden horse, its details so fine and realistic that it seemed almost alive. But this was no ordinary toy. Saddlebags had been carved along its sides, and nestled within one of them was a tiny wooden foal. "It's a mama horse and her baby," Lucy breathed, her voice filled with wonder as she examined the intricate carving. "Just like we're going to be a family with a baby brother or sister." Clara felt her cheeks warm at the implication in Lucy's words, though she noticed that Boone's expression showed nothing but gentle amusement at her daughter's assumption that marriage would naturally lead to siblings. "The baby horse is just starting to learn about the world," Boone explained to Lucy, "but it knows it's safe because its mama is there to protect it and teach it everything it needs to know. And now our family will have a papa horse too," Lucy observed with satisfaction, "to help protect the baby and teach it how to be strong." Clara met Boone's eyes over Lucy's head, seeing in them the same mixture of love and commitment that she felt in her own heart. They had both learned hard lessons about loss and redemption, about the difference between the love that came easily and the love that had to be fought for and earned. "Speaking of family," Boone said quietly, "I have something for you too, Clara." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, its surface polished to a warm glow. Inside, nestled on soft velvet, lay a delicate gold locket that had obviously been crafted with the same care and attention that characterized all of Boone's work. "It's beautiful," Clara whispered, lifting the locket to examine the intricate engraving on its surface. "But you've already given me so much." "Open it," Boone suggested, his voice soft with the kind of emotion that came from knowing you were about to give someone something precious. Clara's breath caught as the locket opened to reveal two tiny photographs, one of Thomas holding baby Lucy and another of herself, and Lucy taken just last week. The message was clear and deeply moving. This new love didn't require her to forget her first love, but rather to honor it while embracing the future. "Now you can carry all of your family with you," Boone said simply, "the past that shaped you and the future we're building together." As Clara fastened the locket around her neck and felt its gentle weight against her heart, she realized that this was what true redemption looked like, not the erasure of past pain, but its transformation into something beautiful and meaningful. Thomas's love had prepared her to recognize and accept the gift that Boone offered, while Boone's patience had allowed her to heal enough to love again. Lucy clapped her hands together with delight as she watched her parents-to-be exchange this meaningful gift. "Now, we really are going to be a perfect family," she declared, with the absolute certainty that had characterized all her observations about their future together. Looking at her daughter's joyful face and meeting Boone's loving gaze, Clara realized that Lucy had been right from the very beginning. Sometimes the most perfect families were the ones that chose each other, the ones that were built from hope and determination rather than simple circumstance. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the people who needed you most were also the ones you needed most in return.